are also fond about, we'll just change the energy regime, quote unquote. That's fine, but what do you mean by changing it? Everyone reduce their energy consumption by 50%? Is that in total or per capita? For example, in 35 years, the population of the United States is going to increase from 300 million to 400 million. And every one of those additional 100 million people will want their vehicle, they want to travel on airplanes, they want their plasma TV, central air conditioning, and all the rest. So when people tell me the U.S. must decrease its energy consumption by 50%, that's a per capita reduction of 60 or 70%. It's going to be a very hard sell to people. So it's incumbent on people who are looking at solutions to define what's the end point here. Before you get somewhere, you have to know where you're going to, where you want to be. Do you want to be in a world situation? And by the way, the world's population is going to increase from 6 billion to 9 billion by 2050. And those additional 3 billion people will want the same things we're all enjoying. So are we talking about a world where per capita energy consumption is 50% of what it is today, 60, 70, 20%? Don't know. And if so, and if it's incumbent upon, if that's your solution, you've got to tell me how we're going to get to reducing per capita energy consumption by 50 or 60 or 70% over the next 20 or 30 years, something that's acceptable to the population of the world. And if you have another endpoint in mind, let me know what that is, and more importantly, you have to define, what is there? Where do you want to be? How do you want to get there? And when do you want to get there? 2020? No, it's already too late, much too late. 2030? It's probably much too late already to change the energy infrastructure by 2030. By 2050, possibly. Still a lot of work to do. So again, if you recognize the problem and you're trying to identify a solution, you have to know what that new energy regime is supposed to look like, when you want to get there, how you're going to get there, and by the way, how you're going to finance it. The bottom line here is that there's no easy, painless solution. Now, what are the possible implications for supply chain management? I think these disruptions I've been talking about will impact virtually all aspects of the supply chain, instability, price volatility especially. And it's not only the high prices that we're looking at in the future. Even more troubling and more difficult to deal with is extreme price volatility, which makes any kind of supply chain or business planning very difficult. The bottom line here is there's increased risk and uncertainty throughout the supply chain. Recommendations on how to address this, I'll talk generically here for a minute and then go into a specific example right after that. I think there are two major ways the supply chain industry can try to prepare for what's in store. In a micro sense, as I've indicated, managers have to recognize what's likely to happen in the future. I mean, recognition and awareness is always a good beginning, and change their plans accordingly. Educate themselves as to the reality and the implications of looming oil shortages, then begin to shift to more efficient and secure modes of transportation and inventory management. All this is obviously desirable at a micro level. At least as important, and probably more so, in a macro sense, it's incumbent upon all participants in the supply chain to encourage their national and regional governments to recognize the implications of what we've been talking about here this morning and take appropriate remedial actions. An individual manager or company, even a large company, can only do so much on its own. It's really up to the governments involved, federal, state, and local, to implement the appropriate incentives and policy. But again, make no mistake of it, no matter what happens and whether the governments screw up or not, the burden of adjustment will fall on industry. Take an example. FedEx is obviously a major player in the supply chain business. It has $32 billion in revenues last year, 250,000 employees, over 700 aircraft and 50,000 vehicles. I was on a program with Fred Smith, the CEO of FedEx, here about 6 weeks ago, and we were talking about this and other factors. He pointed out that in 2006, FedEx spent $3.5 billion on fuel. This year, they're looking at something upwards of $4 billion, perhaps more. Even for FedEx, that's a lot of money. He and they are very concerned. At the micro level, some of the things they're doing, they tried fuel price hedging. It didn't work. They've just gone to utilizing fuel surcharges, and every FedEx bill you get these days, you'll see a nice little fuel surcharge on it, which is nice. I guess FedEx can do it. A lot of other people probably can't. They're actively seeking more fuel-efficient and hybrid vehicles, delivery trucks, vehicles for their fleet, trying to get much better gas mileage. They're also exploring the use of alternative aviation fuels, biomass, and coal to liquids used to fly their airplanes. At the macro level, Fred is co-chairing what's called the Securing America's Future Energy, which is dedicated to reducing U.S. imports, increasing U.S. energy supply, trying to raise this on the radar screen of the government in Washington. It's active encouraging the federal government to develop alternative fuels, such as gas liquids, coal to liquids, biomass to liquids, so we have something besides petroleum, of which we are now, the U.S. is importing about 66% of its requirements. FedEx is also very active in promoting that the U.S. federal government drastically increase overall vehicle fuel efficiency standards. All these, I think, are wise moves, because the more fuel that can be alternatively produced or saved or conserved over the years simply means that there's more of that fuel left for outfits like FedEx and indeed for the rest of the supply chain. I've given this and similar speeches many times over the past several years. I've always asked for recommendations as to what governments can or should do. There are several here I think that are appropriate. As far as Australia goes, I spent the last several days in Canberra, and I think one thing which would be useful would be for the Australian federal government to set up an independent entity to look at this problem, not a government agency or not a government department, but independent objective entity to look at this problem and to develop a whole broad portfolio of solutions that are not necessarily mitigation options, if you wish, that are not necessarily politically correct or popular or cheap or easy, but are realistic and present them in a realistic manner so that the government and indeed the entire country has an information base to understand what may be required, how long it will take, what it will cost, and, at least as important, the implications of doing nothing, which, as far as I can tell, Australia and the U.S. have been very good at the past several decades. On the demand side, the federal government should stress transportation efficiency in all vehicles, enhanced fuel efficiency standards for all types of vehicles. Again, this is something that should have been done a long time ago. On the supply side, the government should pursue all viable options, whether it's coal to liquids, oil shale, oil sands, enhanced oil recovery, biodiesel, biomass, plug-in electric vehicles, electric hybrids, what have you. We don't have the luxury of discounting or discrediting any particular option on either the demand side or the supply side. Some of these options will fall out of their own weight. Others will be successful. And 10 or 20 years from now, we will know which ones were successful and which are not. Today, we don't know, and we can't afford not to bet on all the viable options that we have. State and local governments should encourage smart growth. That's a U.S. term. What it basically means is type of growth that is mass transit or rail focused. So when you tell people to stop driving, they have some option. They can ride the subway, the metro, the light rail, what have you. As you're aware, in Australia as well as the U.S., development in recent decades has been increasingly in the fringe areas of the metropolitan areas where there are no mass transit, no rail opportunities. So when the crunch comes and you tell people you got to stop driving so much, you got to find an alternative way to get to your work. Well, if you live 50 kilometers from your job and there's no rail or bus or anything, how else are you going to get there? Now, the good news is if the economy crashes, you don't have a job, you don't have to worry about it. But that's not a good solution either. And local governments, state governments have to expedite the siting of substitute fuel facilities. In the U.S., it's almost impossible to build anything. A new power plant, a refinery, a coal to liquids facility, a disposal facility, you know, the old NIMBY, not in my backyard syndrome, LNG facility, they can't site these as well. Nobody wants them anywhere near them. That has to stop. As I said, there's a lot of unpopular options that have to be pursued here. Finally, all levels of government, this at least is probably the most important recommendation, all levels of government should educate the public to the fact that we face a serious liquid fuels problem that will require controversial and unpopular measures to both reduce demand and increase supply. And I'll repeat, controversial and unpopular measures. There's no easy, cheap, free way out of this. And until the public realizes this, and unless they realize this, they'll never go along with the types of government's policies and mandates that will eventually, probably sooner rather than later, be required. They'll not make a sacrifice, not be willing to even think about making a sacrifice unless they're absolutely convinced that it's absolutely necessary. Unless aggressive mitigation initiatives are begun soon, it could happen again.